We're pleased to be joined today by Professor Avi Bell, a law professor at Bar-Ilan University and the University of San Diego. Professor Bell is also a senior fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum and is among the world's leading experts in international law and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Professor Bell, thank you so much for joining us today. As we mark the 100th anniversary of the San Remo Conference, can you please share with us your thoughts on the significance of the day and how, in your view, it impacts the Arab-Israeli conflict?
Thank you, first of all, for having me here. It's great to be here. This is a momentous occasion. I have to say, the San Remo Conference took place over the course of a week. From April 19th to April 26th, 1920, I believe. And that overlaps with some days of importance in the modern calendar. This year, the 100th anniversary overlaps with the marking of Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day in the state of Israel. And there is, unfortunately, a connection between those events as well, as I want to explain. But let me take a step back, if I may. We're coming up right now we're getting close to the end of the first century of the Arab War on Zionism. The attempt of the Arab states to first prevent the creation of a Jewish state, and since then, since Israel was created in 1948, to destroy it, to prevent its continued existence. And as we look back at this 100-year period, I think it's important to understand just how far we've gotten. Today, the state of Israel is the home of the world's largest Jewish community. It is the first Jewish state that we've had in 2 millennia. It's as powerful as any Jewish state in our homeland has ever been. We rival in relative strength any of the ancient kingdoms of Israel. We are a world power economically. We are a world power technologically. We are world power militarily. We have a host of incredible achievements to take pride in. And if you think back a little further than the period of San Remo, if you think, for example, of Jews who may have lived in what is today Iraq or what is today Poland 250 years ago, this would just simply be inconceivable to them. I think that it's an incredible place in which to be. At the same time, we find ourselves in a very unusual position because at the same time as we've achieved all these many things, we live in a funny world. And we live in a world where, in general, there's an assault on the very concept of truth, on historical memory, on historical fact, on general legal conceptions that we've always thought as central to order in the world. And that assault, this relatively new assault on truth, has combined with the ancient and terrible prejudice of anti-Semitism to create this parallel universe in which, notwithstanding the great achievements of the State of Israel to date, there is an international assault on everything about Israel and the Jewish state, to deny the Jewish people our rights, our legal rights, our moral rights, our historical rights, our very identity. So we live, as we look back at this conference of 100 years ago, we're looking back on the one hand at a period of great accomplishment, and at the same time, we're looking back from a position where basic truths are no longer believed by some people. So as we look back at the 100 years, the one time we have to take some pride in our accomplishments, but we also have to remember this historical truth that's under assault. And so I want to talk a little bit about San Remo, what it was and what its importance is for us today, particularly in the world of international law. So if you look back 100 years at the point at which the San Remo Conference was taking place, at that point, the land of Israel was part of the imperial possession of the Ottoman Empire, which had just lost in World War I to the combined Allied powers, France, Britain, the United States, and others. The Allied powers had gathered in a series of peace conferences. The first one was famously in France at Versailles, but also then in San Remo during April of 1920 to figure out what to do with the colonial and imperial possessions of the empires that had been defeated in World War I. The empires that had been defeated were Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Austro-Hungary, and all of their overseas imperial possessions, all of their imperial possessions around the world were stripped away from them. Now, in World War I, during the course of the war, the President of the United States at the time, Woodrow Wilson, came up with a very novel idea. His idea was that instead of handing over the colonies and territorial possessions of the empires to a different empire, the peoples of the world would get to enjoy something that we would call over time self-determination, the right to govern themselves. And this was the central principle that was animating what the British, the French, the Americans, the Italians, the Japanese wanted to do with all the imperial possessions. And when they came to the possessions of Ottoman Empire, this included making provision for the Jewish people. The British had announced this as early as 1917, while the war was still going on. In the famous Balfour Declaration of November 1917, they announced that they favored the recreation of the Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. And they pledged themselves to helping the Jews return to the land and reconstitute that homeland. And when the Allied powers of France, Britain, Italy, and Japan gathered in San Remo for their peace conference, their aim was to divide up the colonial possessions of the Ottoman Empire among the various peoples of the Middle East, and including the Jews, to make sure that the Jews would get what they were promised in the Balfour Declaration. Now, it wasn't just important historically, it was important legally. And the reason that it was important legally was that the countries, the Allied countries, had already agreed in the peace treaty in Paris, the Treaty of Versailles, to create a system of what they called mandates, international trusts for all the colonial possessions around the world to help the people achieve their self-determination, to help them achieve independence. And if you read the Treaty of Versailles, you will get to a portion that we now recognize as the Charter of the League of Nations. And the Charter of the League of Nations established the authority of these Allied powers of France, Britain, Italy, Japan, to designate countries that would run mandates and to set them up for future independence. So when the Allied powers, when Britain, France, Italy, and Japan gathered in San Remo, and when they voted to award a mandate over the land of Israel, which they called Palestine, over the land of Israel to Britain, and when they charged Britain with carrying out its pledge in the Balfour Declaration to reconstitute the Jewish homeland, that wasn't just a political promise. That was a legally binding decision that made a mandate in Palestine, in the land of Israel, that was by international law a trust on behalf of the Jewish people. It bound the British to carry out the terms of the mandate as they would later be approved by the League of Nations in April 1922, which included a Jewish right to immigration, a Jewish right to acquire citizenship, a Jewish right to close settlement on the land, a Jewish right to be involved in the governing of the territory, and the way we understand mandates, eventually to achieve independence, which is what led to the Jewish state in 1948. So this is an important legal achievement. Now, it's important to remember as well that international law doesn't always take care of itself. And so in the 1930s, as the Nazi menace took over first Germany and then began to take over the rest of Europe, the British looked at the situation and they decided to violate international law. They decided not to respect the Jewish right to immigration. They determined not to respect the Jewish right to close settlement on the land. They determined not to respect the Jewish right to reconstitute their homeland. And so when the countries of the world met in 1938 in France to determine what to do with the increasing number of Jews that were trying to flee Europe, the condition that the British placed on the conference was that they were not permitted to even raise the possibility of Britain following the law and allowing the Jews into Israel, into the land of Israel, into what they called at the time, what we called at the time, Palestine. And the result is that millions and millions and millions of Jews were murdered on the soil of Europe because Britain refused to follow international law, to abide by the promise that it had made in San Remo, to follow the instructions that it had received from the League of Nations in 1922. And instead, it closed all those people out of their homeland and doomed them to be murdered by the Nazis and their allies. And so one of the things that we have to remember is that there's this history out there that is related to everything terrible that happened, everything terrible and everything wonderful that happened to the Jews during the last century. We had international rights. We had international legal rights. They were not respected, and tragedy resulted. And hopefully we will never, ever allow that to happen to us again. That's one thing to remember. A second thing to remember about San Remo and about our legal rights is that San Remo was part, as I said, of this process of creating a legal obligation for a mandate. And the legal obligations were not only that Britain was in charge of this territory, the Mandate of Palestine, but also that it had to respect Jewish rights of self-determination. And if you read the Articles of Mandate as they were approved by the League of Nations in April 1922, you'll see almost every other paragraph refers to Jewish rights. Jewish rights not as individuals, but as a people. Right? That is the essence of what rights of self-determination mean. And those rights of the Jewish people, legal rights, didn't go away just because the British walked away from the mandate in 1948 and because Britain decided to violate the laws of mandates much earlier than that. Those legal rights were preserved forever by Article 80 of the UN Charter, which stated that the legal rights that were created under the mandates remained in force unless replaced by another agreement. There was no replacement agreement here. The Jewish people have all the self-determination rights that they were promised in San Remo and in the Articles of Mandate, and they have never gone anywhere. We are still entitled to them. Now, this gets us to the last point, and that has to do with, well, now as I said, now we are 100 years forward. There actually is a Jewish state, a successful Jewish state. It's a Jewish state with an incredible record of accomplishment, but it still has enemies, and those enemies still not only deny the legitimacy of the state of Israel. Not only deny the legitimacy of a Jewish state, they also deny the territory of that state. They deny that the Jewish people are entitled to a state, and they deny that now that the Jewish people have a state, that they have any legal entitlement to those areas of mandate that were illegally conquered and occupied by neighboring Arab states from 1948 to 1967. What they call the West Bank and what we call Judea and Samaria, what they call East Jerusalem, and what they call the Gaza Strip. Right? All these areas were designated by the mandate, by the Articles of Mandate, as part of the area where the Jewish homeland was to be reconstituted. And all of those areas, when Israel declared its independence in 1948, became part automatically of the sovereign territory of the State of Israel by operation of a legal doctrine that bears the terrible Latin name of uti possidetis juris, which basically means that when new states are created, they inherit all the territory of the previous administrative unit, meaning that the new State of Israel inherited all the territory of the Mandate of Palestine. Now, that's important today when we're looking at trying to resolve the fate and the governance of parts of Judea and Samaria. As we know, it's one of the things that's being discussed today is applying Israeli law to parts of Judea and Samaria as part of the background to an attempt by the Trump administration, the United States, to create a peaceful resolution to the conflict. And if you listen to the narrative of the enemies of the Jewish state, they describe this land as the land where Israel wants to apply its own laws. They describe it as, quote, occupied Palestinian land. It's not occupied Palestinian land. The land of Palestine is the land of Israel, and it was designated by the nations of the world, bindingly by international law, as early as 1920 for the Jewish people. It became sovereign territory of the Jewish state in 1948 by operation of the doctrine of uti possidetis juris. If and when Israel applies its law to parts of the territories of Judea and Samaria, it will be exercising its own legal rights. It will be granting legal rights to the residents of those territories, and it will be fulfilling the promise that was made all the way back 100 years ago in the San Remo Conference.
You were basically explaining that the Jewish people's legal rights in the land of Israel has had a legal basis all along. How can we basically how can we fight what is happening in the international arena, basically? Because we've seen over and over again that, legal matters are being accepted, agreements are being signed, but then it looks like it has been forgotten. How can we deal with that?
I think that's an excellent question, and the San Remo experience is one that we have to bear in mind here. If you look at the aftermath of World War I and all the various agreements that were made at the time, which includes not only the San Remo Resolution, but the Paris Peace Treaty, the mandates that were approved by the League of Nations. There is even an agreement. People forget this today. There is an agreement between the Zionist organization, between Chaim Weizmann and the representative of the Arabs at the Paris peace talks, Faisal, who later became the king of Iraq, and at the time was the representative of the Arabs hoping to create states in the Middle East, which, by the way, they were able to as a result of the conference. And alongside, as the conference was taking place, as the European powers were negotiating what to do with the imperial and colonial possessions, Weizmann and Faisal reached an agreement. They reached an agreement that accepted the Balfour Declaration, that the Arabs would help the Jews reconstitute their homeland in Palestine, that would help the Jews immigrate to Palestine, that would help the Jews engage in, quote, close settlement on the land of Palestine. And all this, we have this series of agreements that created legal rights. Now, it would be a mistake to focus, let's say, on the Faisal-Weizmann agreement as opposed to the actions of the League of Nations. The League of Nations is more important legally than Faisal-Weizmann. But together, all these agreements created some legal rights. And yet, as we see from the history that took place thereafter, the legal rights were forgotten, they were lied about, they were disobeyed, and the result was that people died. So I think that it's always important when you're thinking about these issues to understand the law is important for us to understand our rights, for us to remember our rights, for us to understand that our claims are just not only historically and morally, but also legally. But at the same time, we always have to remember the law does not enforce itself. Right? The law does not automatically make things happen. Just because the British were required under international law to let Jews enter the land of Israel didn't mean that they actually did it. Just because international law tells us that the state of Israel has sovereign rights over Judea and Samaria does not tell us that any other state in the world is going to respect the law. In fact, as we can see, most of them don't. Most of them lie and say that Israel has no rights. And so the law does not enforce itself. And if we've learned nothing from the experience of the last 100 years, we should at least learn this. Don't rely on the law. Right? The reason that the Jews died by the millions in Europe is because they were powerless to defend themselves. It's not because they lacked legal rights. They had legal rights, but legal rights don't help you when Nazis want to murder you. Legal rights are not the answer for Israel. What ultimately is the answer for the state of Israel is the actions that it takes to defend itself, the actions that it takes to assert and defend its own rights, not this reliance on international legal principles, which I'm sorry, I can guarantee you nobody else is going to respect.
Great, fascinating. Thank you, Avi, for this wonderful talk. It was eye-opening for me, and I hope we get some more of those. Thank you.
Thank you.